recommendation to, if you're at R6, which is pretty big beans in that pod, and you got a fair amount of aphids on there and it's dry, but you think you got a good crop coming, we should still be pulling the trigger. So that's kind of a change from what maybe Iowa State's been recommending in the past, that, you know, once we get to that R5 time frame, just let them go. But if you had pretty good crop potential, you know, it's somewhat on the dry side and you're getting 200-300 aphids per plant, to go ahead and still pull the trigger and protect that yield. So that's kind of, you know, some of the latest information that's kind of changed maybe just a little bit on soybean aphid recommendations. The other thing that I want to talk about just a little bit, so this is the soybean leaf, and for those of you that got pretty good eyes, what's that chewing on the soybeans? Someone take a guess. Close. Corn rootworm beetle. I should have said I'd given somebody a free bag of seed if they would have gave me the right answer. And then everybody would have been throwing stuff out like crazy. So it's actually rootworm beetles. How many of you guys, when you go out in your soybean fields, have been finding these guys? These little Iowa Hawkeye stripe guys. Huh? Yeah? So let me ask you this. I don't know if I got a clicker question here or not. I don't. How many of you guys had rootworm feeding on first year corn after soybeans this year, last year, the year before? Had a few? Okay. I guess I've been seeing some trends, and you guys, if you want to, can chime in and let me know what you're seeing, but I'm getting more and more reports every year that we're getting rootworm feeding in first year corn. And so we're going to start doing a few more sticky traps in some of these fields to see if it's northerns or if it's westerns. If it's northerns, it could be just that extended diapause where they sleep for a full growing season and not hatch, you know, when the soybeans are in there, and then go ahead and hatch when the corn's out there. But these westerns don't do that. So I guess if you do have westerns and it was rootworm damage first year corn, and you're seeing these guys all flying around, we might be seeing a little bit of switch in our biology. There's a couple other trends though that I've noticed with these problem fields. One is that the year before, they did not spray the beans with a fungicide insecticide. And that's what I was kind of getting at with this. If you guys are borderline on your aphids, but you're seeing these guys out in your soybean field, and you know you're going back to corn next year, do you think if they're doing all this stuff, they're going to take the time to fly over to the neighboring cornfield to lay their eggs? Or do you think they're just going to burrow in the ground right there and probably do their duty? Okay, so that might be an added benefit that we're getting from going out and spraying aphids late, is we're killing these guys and reducing the egg laying. So I guess getting back to those first year corn problem fields, did not get a fungicide insecticide when that was in soybeans, and it was maybe some fuller season soybeans. So what the thought is when the corn's done pollinating and the silks are all dried up, they're looking for some fresh green lettuce essentially. And if you've got a nice full season soybean that's still green in the neighboring field, what are they going to do? Possibly get up and move over and start doing feeding like that and then laying their eggs. So just something to maybe keep in mind, that might be an added benefit to coming in and spraying for aphids. And I actually had a couple guys this year, they didn't have too many aphids, but they had a ton of rootworm beetles in their soybean fields, and actually pulled the trigger and put an insecticide on more so for the rootworm beetles than for the aphids. So I guess for those of you guys that did have first year damage, Brett, that you talked to, I guess what were the trends in those fields?
Well, and that's the reason I wanted you to bring it up, is that we've had some isolated issues, especially in this direction, and we had some pockets, and you know, we're just trying to track down answers, and that late aphid question was just, that's such a hard call to make, the 15th to 20th of August, and you know, do I or don't I, and I guess that was why I wanted you to visit about it. So,
sure. Yeah.
Now, with rootworm lines in our traps, we didn't find many westerns. It was mostly northern.
It was more northern, so maybe it was an extended diapause thing going on.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Would you say this is the last couple of years that a trend that's definitely on the increase.
Correct.
I mean, it seems
Yep.
like the last couple of years, really seeing a lot more.
Yeah. And the one thing that we have been doing, and I'll offer out that if you guys want to be part of this, let us know, is we're doing this sticky trap project where we're actually setting these pheromone sticky traps out, and you can see all the rootworm beetles that'll fly onto there and get stuck, and then we can kind of monitor what the populations are doing. We're actually going to place some of these in soybean fields this year. That way we can see, okay, are there a bunch of them here? Do we need to start either using insecticide or triples on our first year corn? So if you guys are possibly interested, we'll be running around sticking a bunch of these out, and it's a pretty neat data set. You can see last year with the cool spring and cold winter that we had, our hatch was extremely late last year. I mean, extremely late. It was probably about 3 to 4 weeks behind normal. And so that's why we all of a sudden, this week 5 was actually like the middle of August when we were finally starting to see the peak. And typically these guys peak, during pollination period. So I guess that's why I bring this up is, if they were running out of food in their cornfield, maybe they moved over into some soybeans. So we just need to kind of keep an eye on it.
And with these sticky traps too, we change these out every week. So we do a count and we submit the information to Troy, and it all gets compiled. So
it's kind of, it's some neat information, and obviously one of the reasons why we're monitoring this is, we're concerned about resistance building in the rootworms. So, and then the other thing that we're now starting to worry about is, are they starting to move out of the cornfields and lay their eggs into the soybeans? They've been doing that in Illinois for about 6 or 7 years now. Have they finally made it this far? I guess I'm not sure. All right, I'm going to switch to some fertility information that we kind of have learned from our research project. So I'll ask you guys a clicker question here and see how many of you I still have with me. So what are your P&K plans for 2015? Apply none, stay with my normal plan, or up my rates as my soil tests keep going down? All right, up to 26 now. All right, stay with my normal plan, and I guess that's great to hear. I was at a couple meetings earlier, where guys are pretty pessimistic about stuff, and they say, well, I'm going to skip it for a year or two, and I guess I'm going to show you some data here that shows that you guys are definitely making the right decision. So I'll ask you one more question. What nutrient do you guys feel is most limiting in your operation? Okay, nitrogen. And I got some pretty neat slides on a nitrogen potassium interaction coming up here. So for those of you guys that maybe were here last year, we did some fields where essentially we had the yield map and they had grid soil sample data. So we kind of overlaid those two to try to say, okay, in the high yielding areas of the field, what's our pH, P, and K levels, low yielding areas, what are they like? And so we found some pretty interesting results from that last year. So on those 20 fields, so we did 40 more of them this year. And what you can see right here, and I'll kind of click through these next slides just a little bit quicker, but what you can see is each one of these bars right here is the average for that farm. So you can see this field right here had an average pH of about 7.2, whereas on the bottom side, that field there had an average pH of about 5.6. And you guys know that do grid testing that can vary all over the board within the field, but that's kind of how they turned out. So here is our average phosphorus levels within those fields, and the green bars are the guys that are the livestock farmers. So you can see, obviously we all know that manure's got pretty good amount of phosphorus in it, and you can see we had some pretty elevated issues there. And the red box, I guess I didn't say this on the previous slide, is where Iowa State recommends we should be. Okay? So here's how the average came out on the potassium, and you can see where Iowa State's recommendation is. I personally think it's too low, but again, you can see where the livestock guys are versus everybody else. And the interesting part was about 43% tested below the optimal level on potassium, where phosphorus was in pretty good shape. So what we did is we told the computer, okay, let's break it out by different yield levels and let's see what the average pH, P, and K level is in each one of those yield environments. So you can kind of see on phosphorus, we kind of played in between this 27 to 30 range all the way up to about 200 bushel corn. And then once we started to get more than 200 bushel corn, you could see those areas of the field, we had a pretty significant increase in our phosphorus levels. And then the really high stuff, the trend actually went down. Kind of same deal with potassium here. We kind of floated in that 160, 180 range, but then once we started getting above 200 bushel corn, we saw a pretty steady tick up in the levels of potassium that were needed in that soil to get those kind of yields. So here's kind of what the 2012 or 2013 data looked like. It was the exact same. And what was interesting in both years, it showed that once you get above 60 or so part per million on your phosphorus, your yields actually start to go down. We can actually have too much of a good thing. And so I guess, don't know how many livestock guys we have in here, but further east, this is actually in the eastern part of the area that I cover, this is actually a pretty big issue. We got guys that have put on so much manure, they got 150 part per million phosphorus levels, and they keep telling me my yields are actually going backwards. What's going on? So if you are one of those guys, actually we're going to try a project this year. We actually think it might be a salt issue. If you ever look at a manure test, there's tons of salt, especially like in hog manure, and that's one of the problems they have out in western part of the U.S. where there's too much salt accumulation. They use gypsum to help free it up. So if there's any of you guys in here that have that, I'd be more than willing to work with you on a project like that. The one thing that I wanted to point out with the soil test is, do you guys remember where the Iowa State red boxes were on phosphorus and potassium on those previous slides? On phosphorus, it was right around about that 20 level. And I guess I should have brought a pointer. I'll go to this side. So Iowa State's recommending we be about right here, 20 part per million on phosphorus. And they're recommending we be about right here on potassium. And so I guess the one thing I'll just put out there is that, in my opinion, that there's a whole lot above that curve that could be left out there. So the other thing that I just want to say, guys, is, I mean, I don't expect anybody to try to bring a farm that's testing 100 part per million up to 300 part per million, because one, it would take a farming career and a hell of a lot of money. But I think the one thing that we do need to keep in mind when it comes to fertility information like this is when we look at how our hybrids performed over the past year. The hybrids that, you know, Brett and John help you guys choose is the most important decision that you make all year in your yield potential and getting that on the right place. And so do we say hybrid A didn't do well versus hybrid B, but hybrid A got put into a fertility situation like this and hybrid B got put into a fertility situation like this? Or maybe hybrid B, you know, hybrid A is actually maybe the best hybrid for your farm, but it just got put in a bad spot, and therefore we make a, you know, decision based on the fertility, not really the potential of the genetics. So just something to kind of keep in mind when you guys do your hybrid selection and you work with Brett and John, you know, on how things performed last year. Whenever I don't care if it's a competitor or one of our products, whenever I talk to people and they say, well, this one didn't do well and this one did, first thing I do is I go back to the soil test, and this is why, just to make sure that we're doing a fair evaluation. All right. Should have had a clicker question here, but corn on the left-hand side is the exact same corn that's on the right-hand side. Planted at the same plant population. Same hybrid, same plant population, same planting date, but we did something different to the corn on the left. What was it that we did to the corn on the left?
Side dress nitrogen.
Side dress nitrogen. Any other guesses? And he's right. Okay. So this is 1151 at 38,000. This was one of our plant population trials, seeding rate trials, that we actually came in and also put additional nitrogen on half of the strip. I kind of gave the answer away here, but is this nitrogen deficiency here? Yes or no? No, actually it's not. What's this? And you can read. It's potassium. And look at the difference. This corn with 50 more units of N is green all the way to the bottom, and this corn with that grower standard rate, you can see is in pretty serious trouble, isn't it? And I saw this a fair amount this year. So why would that happen? Why would 50 more units of nitrogen on the left prevent a potassium deficiency? If you guys get this, I'll really buy you a bag of corn. So, yeah, you're not included. I should have gave my disclaimer before I made the statement, right? So when you think about it, you go back to fertility. The fertility basics is for every pound of nitrogen a corn plant takes up, it takes up a pound of potassium. And those things work kind of hand in hand. They're kind of tied together. One helps bring the other up. So what happens if a corn plant doesn't have enough nitrogen to take up? What happens to the potassium part? They can't bring the potassium up either. Now let's do the flip side. Remember some of those soil test levels I was showing you that we had? What happens if your potassium soil test is really low? How much nitrogen can you bring up? Can it limit your nitrogen? And it can. So that's the one thing, you know, when I visit with guys, I can probably, it's not too hard of a sell to tell, especially when a field looks like this, you need 30 more pounds of nitrogen. How many of you guys would go out and put on 30 more pounds of nitrogen if your field looked like this? If I told you you needed 80 more pounds of potash, how many would you go out and put on 80 pounds of potash? One hand, two hands. That's the most I've ever gotten. Usually it's 0, right? So here's an excellent study that was done by Ohio State, just to prove that I'm not 100% crazy. I might 50%, but not 100%. So what they have here is two different plots. What you see in the green line is basically soil that is deficient on potassium, 80 part per million. You know, and Iowa State recommends that we should be at, they used to recommend 140, 150, now it's up to 200. So that's 80, so that's pretty bad. The other plot here has about 140 part per million potash. And so what they did is they split these little plots up and they added different amounts of nitrogen. And you can kind of see the different amounts of nitrogen here on the bottom. And you can see on the blue line, we basically peaked at yield with 180 units and we got 211 bushels per acre of corn. Where we are deficient on potassium, they put up to 280 pounds of nitrogen on and only got 167 bushels. So what's that tell us about maybe our nitrogen use efficiency on some of these soils that are potassium deficient? And like I said, you drive by and you see your corn's yellow, so the first thing to do is, well, next year I need to go out and put on more nitrogen. This field's starving of nitrogen, and actually you could, you know, pour the coals to it if on nitrogen. If your potassium is in that range, probably less than 100 part per million, you're just burning your money away. So just something else to kind of keep in mind as you guys make your plans for the upcoming year.
Now, in that situation, you couldn't correct the potash deficiency that year, could you?
Probably, definitely not this late. Now, if you start to see, let's say for example, you get the corn in the ground and all of a sudden you realize that, crap, I should have put some potash on this field, or maybe you just finally, new farm that you picked up, you just finally got the soil test back. There are some spiked injection wheel units that it's almost like, how many of you guys have seen those manure applicators that I think it's almost like, it looks like almost a Phoenix Harrow, but it's actually got spikes that actually shoot the manure in through like a hollow cone kind of type thing. They actually have almost what looks like some side dress units of that that run, you know, probably 6 inches away from the row that you can go in and spike that in. And the thing is we'd want to get, if you do side dress anything, you'd want to do it early because potassium, almost 100% of our potassium is taken up by the time the corn tassels. So it's not like we can come in real late and save it. And then the other thing is potassium doesn't move much. So you apply potassium, it's probably on a good year with a good amount of rain, it's probably only going to move that far. So really we have to be correcting our potassium issues, you know, before we make that final pass of tillage to make sure that we get it worked in. But this interaction, I guess I'm seeing more and more of this and somewhat understand, you know, with rented ground, you know, we don't want to be spending a whole lot of money out there to try to build potassium levels when you know that you're not going to have the farm the next year. I mean, I can understand that, But the thing that we need to definitely watch out for is when we start getting into situations like this, you know, not only are we going to get hurt on yield for potassium, but our nitrogen use efficiency is also going to kind of go down the toilet pretty quick as well.
And just to add,
Yeah.
the soil sampling that we do here, you guys would be shocked to know that 75 to 80% of the soil samples we do are deficient in potassium. Part of the reason is they raised the bar, Iowa State did, and we've always been trying to shoot for that.
Yeah.
Choice at 140. Now that they bumped it up, we're kind of in catch-up mode, I'd say. But on the other hand, on the phosphorus side, our phosphorus levels as a whole are really good. So I guess if you've got a fertilizer dollar to spend, and without looking at soil samples, I'd say if you wanted to guess what you had to do, I'd definitely go with potassium.
Yeah, absolutely. Good comment. Yeah.
Yeah, you rotate with beans, we kind of lower your phosphate too.
Yeah, beans are potassium
Beans are
hogs.
potassium.
Yeah, and I guess to me, planting beans without applying potassium fertilizer would be like planting corn without putting on nitrogen. I guess in my opinion. Absolutely. You know, and if maybe if there was, you know, hay in the rotation years ago, before the livestock went, a lot of them fields got sucked way down and never got built back up. The other thing, I guess, if you guys are working with your fertilizer retailer and maybe you're doing variable rate fertilizer applications or even just doing blanket applications based on kind of what your historic yields have been, I personally believe that the Iowa State removal rates are too low. I think they recommend like 0.35 units of phosphorus for every bushel of corn. I think that should be 0.4. And on potassium, they're about the same. They actually only say 0.3 on potassium. I think that should almost be 0.45. And the reason why I say that, we got some customers that I work with who have been fertilizing. Maybe, you know, they use their yield map to kind of do a variable rate fertilizer application, and they've been a little bit on the aggressive side of those numbers. And if you look at their soil tests over the last, 4 years ago, 8 years, 12 years ago, their soil test levels are still coming down. So I personally think the removal rates that we're basing our recommendations off of are too low also. So just something to kind of keep in mind. And I encourage you too, on farms that maybe you guys own or you've had for quite a while, is pull out those soil tests from the 4 years ago, and then look at 8 years ago, and then look at 12 years ago, or whenever your soil testing cycles were, and kind of see what the trend is. And especially if it's something that you know that you're going to have control of for a while, I definitely at least try to stabilize those the best you can.
I think the other thing, Troy, is that you get a soil test map back, you're gonna see some areas that say, hey, it doesn't call for any potash. You're gonna say, hey, that's great, I don't have to spend any money on that acre. But then it goes back to, I think, the devil's in the details, that it's gonna matter if you're at 201 parts per million versus 270 parts per million. If you're at that 201, in theory, you're not gonna put any potash on that for 4 years, and by the time you get that test back, again, you're gonna be disappointed.
Yeah, good point. I'm not a real strong believer of a spot getting zero. I mean, we don't have to be maybe putting on full removal rate, but we should be putting on dang close. We've got a sweet spot in that field with fertility. Why let it go? I mean, we don't have to be as aggressive, but our yield data shows that if we got it there, boy, you can really buffer yourself from yield swings by keeping the fertility levels up. Good questions. Any other questions or comments on that? All right, a couple things here to go through, and then we can open it up for questions. One of the things that you might be seeing in some farm magazines or Iowa Farmer Today is we're coming out with a new seed treatment, and you're going to see some of it on some of our corn products